Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Catholic International University's Student Life Office Hour Discussion Night, featuring Dr. Daniel Koenemann. I'm your host, Stephanie Garrett, the director of the Catholic International Library and the faculty advisor to Student Life. As we wait for everyone to enter the meeting room, please take a moment to answer the poll that is on your screen. While we wait for everyone to enter the room, I would like to take a moment to go over a few Zoom housekeeping items. As you may have noticed, you are automatically muted. Please leave your microphones off until we reach the Q&A portion of tonight's presentation. While we enjoy seeing everyone in the audience, if you are having connectivity issues, please feel free to stop your video. You may put your questions into the chat box at any time during the meeting, and we will try to answer as many as possible during the Q&A portion. During Q&A, you can ask your question live by using the raise your hand feature in the Zoom toolbar. And when you are called on, please feel free to turn your microphone on and ask your question. The recommended view option for tonight's session is Speaker View. Click the view icon on the top right corner of your screen and then select Speaker option. Please note that tonight's session is being recorded. For those of you who are just coming into the meeting room, please take a moment to answer the poll on your screen as we are about to begin. Here's our agenda for the evening. We will begin with a prayer, and then Dr. Koenemann will present. We'll have a Q&A session and then some closing remarks. As you leave the Zoom session, a short survey will open in your browser. Please be sure to complete the survey after the meeting. This is a good opportunity for you to tell us how you feel about the session and what you would like to know more about or other topics of interest. All responses are anonymous. So we will begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, I'd like to welcome educator and author Daniel Koenemann. Dr. Koenemann holds a doctorate from Howard University and has been an educator at the undergraduate and graduate levels since 2020. He is currently an assistant professor of biology at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, as well as here at Catholic International University. Dr. Koenemann's biological interests are in plant diversity in all its various forms, taxonomic, ecological, genetic, metabolic, and morphological. His research typically focuses on plant classification and evolution below the genus level, floristics, and the evolution of plant sexual breeding systems. He has written a number of scholarly articles in these areas. Dr. Koenemann's theological interests are in Catholic dogma. He has written on the narrative reconciliation of contemporary theories of biological evolution with the text of the early chapters of the book of Genesis, and popular articles examining the intersection of the Catholic faith and science and culture at the blog 1 Peter 5. Welcome, Dr. Daniel Koenemann.
Thank you very much.
I've stopped. Okay.
Cool. All right, you can hear me. We're good.
We're good.
All right. So thank you everyone for coming to my talk tonight. And as perhaps you saw the title, we're going to be talking a little bit about tropical tree diversity. And at the end, we'll talk about why it matters. So Stephanie did a very good job of introducing me. But I currently teach the biology class here at Claflin at Catholic International University, and I recently taught at Claflin University, and my interests are in plant diversity. So I am by training what you would call a plant systematist. What does that mean? Plant systematics and really systematics in general, you could do systematics on insects or mammals or really anything, but systematics involves two major fields of study, phylogeny and taxonomy. And so phylogeny is the study of the hypothesis of evolutionary relationships among organisms. And in this case, it would be plants. And then taxonomy is basic classification. It's describing organisms, giving them names, and then determining how to identify them and tell them apart from other similar organisms. And so systematics encompasses these two major areas of biology. Within systematics, there are a couple of things you could do with your time. You could do monography, which is basically just picking a group of organisms, like a genus or a family, and just learning everything there is to learn about them, and then writing a treatment or writing a paper on them to tell the world about this group of organisms. You could study biogeography, which is how plants or animals are distributed in space and time, and how those distributions change over time, because animals that live in one place at one period in time may actually change the location where they live over the course of decades or centuries or longer periods of time. You could study floristics, which is something that I've definitely done, which is just trying to document, come up with a list of the organisms, again, in this case, plants, that grow in a particular location. And that location is up to the definition of whoever's doing the flora. You could do a park, for example. You could write a flora of a particular park, where you just try to come up with a list of all of the plants that grow in that park. And then you can study, as a plant systematist, the way that plants and animals interact with each other. Now, the question might be, why? Systematics comes off as a somewhat of an esoteric subject matter, whether you're studying plants or any other group of organisms. But whenever this comes up, I definitely have to defend my field of study, because it's critically important to biology. You basically can't do the rest of biology if you don't first do the systematics. For example, ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms. But you can't study those relationships if you cannot first reliably name and identify the organisms in question. If you don't know what organism A and organism B are, you can't study how they relate to each other. Or think of a case of development of medicines. Nearly all medicines are ultimately derived from some compound that was made in a plant or an animal. But if you can't go out and reliably refine that same plant, it's very difficult to study that compound and come up with a useful treatment for a human. And then finally, conservation, right? You cannot conserve a thing if you don't know it exists, and you don't have a name for it, and you don't know where it lives, and you can't find it reliably, right? If you don't have all that information first, it's impossible to do the rest of this. So systematics is really the foundation for all other biological sciences. A little more background, right? Today our talk is about the tropics, so I thought it would be important to give a little discussion of what the tropics are and why they're important on Earth, and then we can talk about the tropical forests and the trees that live there. So what are the tropics, and how do we define them? Well, the tropics are essentially a band, a geographic region around the middle of the Earth, kind of like the belt of the Earth, which you can see here on this diagram. This comes about essentially as a result of the tilt of the Earth. So the Earth, as we know, goes around the sun. Every 1 year, the Earth makes it around the sun one time. But the Earth isn't sitting kind of straight up and down. It's actually tilted a little bit to the side, about 23 degrees. So what this means is that in certain seasons, different parts of the Earth are facing away from the sun. So in this season over here, let's say the winter of the Northern Hemisphere, where Catholic International is, our side of the Earth would be facing away from the sun, whereas if we go around to the other half of the year, the summer, our side of the Earth would be facing towards the sun and receiving more direct sunlight. That's why it's effectively why it's hotter during the summertime and why it's cooler in the wintertime, because we get less sunlight. Now, there are places on Earth that will always receive some form of direct sunlight. And they are in this band in the middle. And this effectively is what we call the tropic zone, right? So you've got the Tropic of Cancer in the north, the Tropic of Capricorn in the south, and in between them, you have this space on the surface of the Earth that's going to receive essentially direct sunlight. Whereas these parts up here, which we call the temperate zones, receive direct sunlight in the summertime and indirect sunlight in the winter. This is critically important for basically determining the major weather patterns of the Earth. So because the equator is effectively always receiving the most sun energy, the most sunlight, it's the warmest there, but it also is the place where we have the most evaporation of liquids, of moisture off of the surface of the Earth. Now, this can be off of lakes, it can be off of the surface of leaves. So the way that the plant's circulatory system works is that they suck up water from the ground, and then the water gets evaporated off of the top of their leaves. It's a process called evapotranspiration. That's effectively how the plant's circulatory system works. It doesn't cycle back around. It's an open circulatory system, basically like a straw. But so you can have evaporation off the top of the leaves, you can have evaporation off lakes, but most importantly, you have evaporation off of the oceans. And so you have the most heating at the middle, you have the most evaporation. Getting all that water into the atmosphere, you therefore also have the most rain, because as this hot, moist air ascends into the upper atmosphere, it cools, it condenses, and it rains back down. So that you get the most evaporation, but also the most rain here in the middle of the Earth. The end result is this distribution of major life zones, which we call the biomes. Tropical rainforests, deserts, temperate forests, grasslands, all of these places are determined effectively by temperature and rainfall. And that's determined by the tilt of the Earth. So you can see here in that same band around the middle of the Earth is where we have all of the tropical rainforests. And then in the areas adjacent to them, we have almost all of the world's major deserts just outside of the tropics. That's not an accident. That's because all of the water got sucked up here, went into the upper atmosphere, and basically rained immediately back down onto this area. And by the time the air cycled back down in these areas, it was dry, making these areas deserts. Now we can divide the tropics into two different sections. The neotropics, or the New World tropics, encompassing the tropical Americas, North, Central, and South America. We have a little bit of tropics kind of in the United States, just south of Florida. And then the paleotropics, or the tropics of the Old World. And even though this kind of this New World, Old World language is, I know it's fashionable now to talk about, European-centric language. It certainly is, but it also has a biological reality behind it. And that these two groups, these two land masses, have been separated from each other for very long periods of time. And so the plants and animals that live and grow here are substantially different than the plants and animals that live and grow here. So it's a useful distinction. Now, the tropics are important not only because they're warmer and effectively wetter, but also because they are the apex of what we call the latitudinal diversity gradient. So this is a phenomenon in biology that's been well documented, that effectively you have more living things per unit area. So more species of things, more biological diversity, closer to the equator, and basically in a decline away from the equator. So as you move towards the poles, you steadily lose the number of species in a particular area, such that when you get to the poles, you have very, very few types of living things there. So this is what we call the latitudinal diversity gradient, and the tropics are the place on Earth with the most species. Now, there are lots of debate about why this is the case? Is it because the tropics are cradles of diversity? That is, that there are more species generated than tropics because they're warmer and wetter and they're better places to live? Or is it because the tropics are museums of diversity? That is, they retain their species better. There are fewer species that go extinct in the tropics. This is a thing that ecologists fight and argue about all the time. It's not going to be the subject of this presentation. What is important to realize is that there are more species at the tropics than there are in other parts of the world. And we can just give an example. So let's look at vascular plants. So these are, or not vascular plants, flowering plants, angiosperms. So not all plants make flowers, the vast majority of them do. There are some primitive groups of plants that don't make flowers, but let's just look at the flowering plants and see some basic numbers. And we can see here that in the tropics, these unit area species numbers are much, much higher. 30,000 species in the Caribbean and Mexico, 35,000 in the Andes, another 35 in the Amazon and in the Cerrados of Brazil. Africa is actually a bit species poor. This is likely because tropical Africa doesn't really have any mountains. And mountains tend to be generators of species diversity. So remember, we have the Andes here, and then over here in Southeast Asia, there are mountains on all of these islands, which also help generate these high numbers of species in what are effectively very small land masses. So you get 10,000 species just in the Philippines. The amount of land area is not very large. That's a lot of species for the Philippines. Whereas you look at just 13,000 species, for example, in all of continental Europe. And this is, again, these are just flowering plants. So you can imagine what European explorers, when they left Europe and went to some of these other parts of the world, the European botanists basically just went crazy because they realized how few plants that they had actually seen and how much more was out there. But to kind of cap all this off, the New World tropics, which is what we're going to be talking about today, the neotropics, is effectively contains about a third of all extant flowering plants. So extant, we think about the word extinct, meaning dead, species that are dead, they're no longer around. The opposite of extinct is extant. Those are species that are still living. And so a third of all of the extant flowering plant species can be found in the tropical Americas. And I think that's, as many of us who are Americans, something that we can be proud of for sure. Now, many of these species are tropical trees. Many of them are herbs, and the distinction between an herb and a tree for botany's sake is that basically a tree has wood and an herbaceous plant does not. So any plant that does not have wood would be considered an herb in like academic botany. But many of these are trees, and the trees are conspicuous, right? If you go to the tropics, some of these trees are massive. I have a picture here of a tree that's several hundred feet tall, growing basically right along the coast. I was standing on the beach more or less as I took this picture of this giant tree. But despite the fact that they're so conspicuous in these forests, they're very difficult to study. They're very big, for one thing. There's no way for you to get up here to collect these leaves, or if you all of the flowers, because all of the flowers are going to bloom up here. All of the pollinators that interact with those flowers will do so up here, several hundred feet off the ground, right? So the size poses a challenge. They're difficult to study because they're so long-lived, right? You and I as humans live only 100 years or so, right? These plants live several hundreds of years, right? So you cannot watch this plant grow from a seedling to an adult. You just can't do it. And then location. A lot of these are very remote locations that are hard to get to. And so it's hard to study these plants because it's expensive and it's difficult to get there. So despite the fact that they're huge, they're conspicuous, they're difficult to study. And then some of the urgent areas of study for these trees then are simply the taxonomy. Can we put names on all of these guys? And there are some areas of the world where that's like kind of all we know. We have a list of the names of the things that we think live in this place, and we really know very little else. The Amazon would be a place like this, and many of the sections of the Andes Mountains are like this. The best we can do is a list of the organisms that live there. So there's still a lot to learn. And then the other thing that's an urgent area of study is life history. This is how these organisms reproduce, how they breed, what other organisms they need to interact with them. Many plants need pollinators, right? But many times we don't know who those pollinators are. So there's many aspects of life history that we don't know that are urgent to study, because you can't keep these plants alive if you don't know what other organisms they need to stay alive. And this is kind of what my research has focused on taxonomy, giving names to these organisms, and then life history, trying to figure out how they make the next generation of themselves. And many botanists do this, and I'm no exception. We focus on a particular group of plants, and the group of plants that I focused on since 2017 or so is the Polygonaceae. This is also commonly known as the buckwheat family. And we, if anyone, I usually say we because I'm talking to a group of students in continental North America, but who knows with Catholic International where all of you are living. But if you live in the temperate zone, then you're probably familiar with this family from a couple of different plants. You probably know the genus Rheum, or rhubarb, which we turn into pies, along with some other ingredients. You probably know the genus Phagopyrum, or buckwheat itself, which has these like pseudograins that you can grind up into a flour. We tend to make pancakes out of them. You can make noodles out of them, and so on. And then you also probably know this genus Rumex. This is probably a weed in your garden. It's probably a weed on the side of the road that you drive by every day and don't notice. But in the temperate zone, it's typically an agricultural weed. There are some cultures, I believe in the Caribbean, they make teas out of them, but for the most part, it's an agricultural weed, more or less omnipresent. But looping us back into our talk tonight about tropical trees, some of the Polygonaceae, excuse me, are tropical exclusively and are woody exclusively. That is, they are trees. And there are a couple of genera here that we'll talk about. So the genus Triplaris, which you can see here, these pink things are actually not the flowers; these are the fruits of this tree. Ruprecia, which is a similar sized, medium-sized tree to Triplaris. Coca-loba, which if you've been to Florida or the Caribbean, you most certainly have seen this plant growing on the beaches. Common name is sea grape, and you can make jellies and such out of it. But a common plant in the Caribbean as well as throughout the neotropics. And then Muehlenbeckia, which is actually present also in the Old World in the Paleotropics. So I'm going to give us 3 little stories of the kind of my research in tropical trees, and then at the end we'll loop it back around into conservation and hopefully have a discussion. So the first of these is going to be some morphometric taxonomy in Triplaris. So Triplaris, again, highlight of this genus. It's not a huge genus, probably about 20 species, though that number varies depending on who you talk to. Medium-sized trees, as you can see here, terrifically straight trunks, usually branching somewhere above the middle. These plants are dioecious, so they have male trees and female trees, and we'll loop back around to that at the end. That's not very common in plants, but it is the case here. You can see here the male flowers with the stamens, and here are the female flowers with the pistils that contain in them the ovules or the eggs. Here are those pink things. These are the fruits again, and sometimes in some species, they're more of a greenish-white color. All right, so what's the interest here? Again, we got 18 to 20 species. Most of these species are pretty narrowly distributed. In fact, the homeland of this genus is right here in the Western Amazon. So you've got the Andes here, which kind of block off this side of the Amazon basin. And then right nestled up against the side of those Andes Mountains is where you'll find most of these species. But a few of the species are incredibly widespread throughout South America. Now, this is also an interesting genus because it has a really cool phenomenon, the ant tree or ant plant phenomenon. And there are a number of different ants associated with this, 3 genera, Pseudomyrmex, Azteca, and Atta. This is a phenomenon that's not common in plants, but it is common enough that it has a name. In Triplaris, the way that this is manifest is that the pith, which is the internal part of the stem, which is typically used to store water and nutrients, is absent, and the stems in Triplaris are completely hollow. The ants use these stems effectively as their house, and this is a mutualism. So the ants receive from the plant a home to live in, these tunnels, these tubes where they make their home. And in return, the ants will actually defend the plant from herbivores. So if you go over and you shake the tree or try to pull leaves off, the ants come rushing out of the inside of the tree and they will sting and bite you and make you go away, right? Because you're effectively attacking their house. So it's this mutualism, it's a cooperation between the ants and the plants in order to be better for both of them. Again, by no means are Triplaris the only organisms that do this. The most famous example is for certain acacia, where you have these big thorns here, and ants actually live inside of the thorns. But also the forget-me-nots, so the Boraginaceae, the forget-me-not families, you can see the hole right here where the ant domatium is, so where the ants go in to live in that little circular swelling there. And then Cecropia, which is in the New World tropics, an almost ever-present weed tree. You find this thing everywhere. It also has hollow stems, and it is filled with stinging ants that will come out and bite you and make your life miserable if you get too close. The acacia, in addition to giving the ants a home in these thorns, they also provide food for the ants. So these little white things on the tips of all of the leaves, those are, we call them Beltian bodies, and they are effectively little starch balls. They're little like bread loaves. And the ants will come and they'll pick these bread loaves off of the tips of these leaves, and they'll bring them back in and they eat them. So the plant provides, in addition to a home, also food for the ants. And the ants that live in acacia are pretty savage. If you ever see an acacia in the wild, you actually see a circular disc around the acacia tree where there's no vegetation, because the ants will actually destroy all of the plants living within like a meter radius of the tree itself. So it almost looks like it's been someone's come out there and kind of trimmed, taken their weed whacker to around the tree, but it's not. It's the ants doing that. In any case, we have Triplaris. One of the species, Triplaris americana, is very widespread, covering effectively the entirety of the New World tropics. The issue is that historically, this one species, Triplaris americana, was actually 15 different species. And they all, if you look at the different plants in different parts of this range, you struggle sometimes to believe that it's the same species, right? So some of the leaves will be long and narrow, some of the leaves will be short and fat. And so the question that I had was, well, is this really one species? And perhaps it's not 15 species, but is it really one? And to answer this question, I did what we call morphometrics. Effectively, we measure parts of the plants. We measure the width of the leaves, the length of the leaves. We measure the pubescence or the hairs on the leaves, or other parts of the plants, the fruits, the shoots, and so on. And then effectively, we use computers and mathematics to compare those lengths and determine whether or not this is all of these plants constitute one group of things, or whether they constitute multiple groups of things, right? So if I had all of these plants here, let's imagine these white dots are plants, is it one group of things, or is it two groups of plants really that just look somewhat similar? Is it three groups of plants that look somewhat similar, four groups, and so on? And effectively what the math told us in this case is that it was likely two groups of plants rather than one. And so again, here we have South America, you've got the yellow line here, effectively the Andes Mountains, and then the blue here would be the Amazon basin. And you can see where the plants in these two groups lie. So plants in group one were effectively in Bolivia, right, the southern Amazonia, and then in the drier parts of Brazil. So these would be kind of a tropical dry forest. Whereas in group two, it looks like it's widespread. Actually, most of the observations were up here in the northern part, Colombia, Venezuela, and so on. And if we look at the morphology of these plants, that is how they physically look, they're different, right? So the leaf length to width ratios are different. And plants in group one tend to have the long, narrow leaves, whereas plants in group two tend to have the shorter and fatter leaves. Similarly, pubescence. Plants in group two tend to have longer inflorescence hairs, so longer hairs, they tend to be hairier than plants in group one. So in conclusion, Triplaris americana, which we currently recognize as a single species, we can actually divide that up into what appears to be two different groups of plants, and that those divisions fall along what we would consider predictable lines. So geography, leaf size, leaf pubescence, those are common characters that we use to distinguish different plant species. Now, is this a new species and should we describe it as such? That remains to be seen a little bit. I have not yet described it as a new species. And in effect, because there were 15 species previously, it would be re-recognizing an old species that we kind of buried. But that's still something under discussion. But the point is that there's more diversity here than meets the eye in this single species of Triplaris americana. All right, let's shift from the large scale visible structures of plants down to genetics, or in this case, genomics. So I'm interested in not only how plants look, but how they build themselves. And the genes of an organism are basically instructions for how that organism gets built. And in plants, they actually have three sets of instructions. They have the genes from their nucleus. They also have chloroplasts and mitochondria in their cells. And the mitochondria and the chloroplast have their own sets of instructions on how to build themselves. So plants have what we call three different genomes, or three different complete sets of genetic material. And I've been working on what we call plastomics. So the genomes, assembling and studying the genomes of the chloroplasts in plants, which can tell us a lot about plants. Remember, the chloroplast is responsible for effectively taking sunlight energy and transforming that sun energy into sugars that the plants can then eat, and then that you and I can eat by effectively taking it from the plant. So the genetics of the chloroplasts are very important to the health of that plant. So studying the chloroplast genome is important. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to assemble for the first time, because nobody has ever done this, the complete chloroplast genome for several of these plants in these different genera of the tropical woody Polygonaceae. So again, Polygonaceae that live only in the tropics and are exclusively woody. So they're trees or they're shrubs. And so we chose to do this for 6 species. Coccoloba rugosa, and that's an error here. You'll see that later on, rugosa. Triplaris cumingiana, Ruprecia coriacea, Podopterus mexicanus, Neomylspagia emarginata, and Gymnopodium floribundum. These here are all endemic, so they only grow in Mexico. And these others grow, these are both in Northern South America, and this one, Coccoloba rugosa, actually grows in the Caribbean in Puerto Rico. So here's a picture of one of these. This is Neomylspagia emarginata. You see, not a huge tree, kind of like a lilac bush almost. So we collected plant material. Some of it we went out into the woods and actually got it. In some cases, we got it from living collections. So if you've ever been to like a botanic garden and they have the walking paths and all the trees, or you go into the big greenhouses, those are scientific collections. And sometimes scientists use those plants for scientific research. And so some of our species were growing in botanic gardens. And so we took leaf material off of those species there. And in other cases, we used herbarium collections. So an herbarium is effectively a library of plants. So botanists go out into the woods, they collect and press plants between 2 pieces of effectively of cardboard, flatten them out, dry them out, and then they glue them onto pieces of paper and they stick them into these cabinets, and we store them there for study. And some of these herbaria are very large. So the herbaria, say, of Paris or the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., 6 million specimens or so each from all over the world, right? So it's effectively a library of plants. You can go in and look at plants from all over the world. And again, these can be used as scientific collections. And so you can take little pieces off of them and extract DNA out of them, which we did in some of these cases. So once we had our leaf material, we extracted the DNA. We ran the DNA out on a gel. So a gel is what it sounds like. It's just kind of gel, like a jello-like structure or texture. And you can run the DNA through it using an electrical current to test whether or not you effectively extracted the DNA. So we did this. And then we cleaned the DNA and we prepared it for DNA sequencing. The sequencing methods I won't go into, but effectively the contemporary or current way people do DNA sequencing is they chop up all the DNA into small little pieces and then use the computer to put those pieces back together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's effectively how we did this as well. Now, before I kind of show the results here, I want to remind people what the chloroplast genome typically looks like. So chloroplasts and mitochondria are effectively bacteria that live inside of our cells, right? Bacteria tend to have circular genomes. So the genome is one single ring of genetic material. In the plant, the chloroplast genome, that single ring has 4 major regions. It has the large single copy region here, a small single copy region, and then 2 inverted repeat regions where the sequences are identical but running in the opposite direction. So then this is what an effectively a successfully assembled chloroplast genome will look like coming out of our methods, out of our experiment, right? You've got your large single copy region, you've got your 2 inverted repeats, which the program cannot distinguish from each other because the sequences are identical, and then you've got your small single copy region up here. And if we look at those, the results of those sequences, I just want to highlight here the assembly length. So each of those genomes, those rings of DNA, was about 170,000 base pairs or nucleotides long. So that sounds maybe pretty large, but in fact, most nuclear genomes are on the order of billions of base pairs. So these are reasonably small genomes. And this was part of a paper that a collaborator and myself recently published, which you can go look up if you'd like to and read more about it. Now, in addition to assembling the genomes, we wanted to compare them to each other. And we found that when we compared those genomes, again, we've got our small single copy region, our large single copy region, and then these bars represent how variable a particular location, a particular gene is in that genome. Right, so a bigger bar means there's more variability between those 6 different species. We can see that most of the variation actually occurs here in the small single copy region, and in many cases in what we call the NDH genes. So these are genes associated with photosynthesis, that is the transformation of light energy into sugar, and in particular, genes that deal with oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is basically we talk about vitamins and free radicals in our body and how vitamins can help kind of absorb and transform free radicals and make them less harmful. It's the same thing here. So plants can make, in effect, their own vitamins to absorb the free radicals. And this is what these genes are about. And because those genes are so important to the survival of the plant, it's not surprising that there's a lot of variation here, a lot of different attempts at being the best at absorbing all of those free radicals. All right, last little story here, and this is actually some work in progress. And then we'll hopefully have a little bit of a discussion. All right, so the last thing that I'm interested in, and this is some of the work that I'm currently involved in right now, is diece and sex determination in plants. And this is maybe a little bit of a hot topic. So among the animal kingdom, 95% of animals are what we call gonochorous. And that is, they have separated the production of gametes onto 2 different individuals. You have one individual who makes eggs and the other individual who makes sperm. In only about 5% of cases of animals do you have production of gametes on the same individual, where one individual makes both sperm and egg. This is how we actually distinguish in biology the difference between males and females, right? We often see in the public discourse this emphasis and fixation on sex chromosomes, but really that's like human specific. Really, it's about where the gametes are produced. The female, across all biological kingdoms, the female produces the large gamete, the male produces the small gamete. The sex chromosomes just kind of tell you which one you are, but that's how we determine males and females, small gamete versus large gamete production. And in some cases, you have different systems than our system that we're familiar with, right? We are familiar with this system, the XXXY system, where females are XX and males are XY. But there is also a common system in birds and some reptiles called the ZZZW system, where females are actually what we call the heterogametic sex. So they have 2 different sex chromosomes, Z and W, and the males have 2 of the same, Z and Z. And this is kind of the opposite of this other system that we're more familiar with, right? Now, what's interesting is that in plants, this situation is actually completely reversed, right? It's like completely complementary. About only 5% of plants are dioecious. That is, they have male trees and female trees, and they've separated the production of sperm and eggs onto different individuals. In rather, 95% of plants are synoecious, or the animal version of hermaphroditic, right? That most plants produce both kinds of gametes, sperm and eggs, on the same individual. This is likely a backup mechanism. Animals can move around to find a mate. Plants cannot. You are rooted in the ground. And so you need a kind of thing to fall back on. If you can't find a mate by sending your pollen out into the wild, at least you can mate with yourself and produce offspring that way. So this is effectively a backup mechanism for most plants. And as far as we can tell, these guys here, the dioecious plants, or the male-female plants, are more evolutionarily recent. So this is a recent phenomenon in plants, whereas gonochory in animals appears to be reasonably ancient. So my interest is really in how do plants determine when there are males and females, who's male and female, right? Because in a typical synoecious or hermaphroditic plant, you can have, all the plants are going to be male and female. You can have a situation what we call outcrossing, right? Where the two different plants can mate with each other, or you can have a condition called selfing, where a single plant mates with itself. But in dioecious plants, we only have outcrossing, right? So you've got a one male tree, one female tree, and they're only capable of mating with other trees. They are not capable of mating with themselves. How then do we decide who's going to be a male and who's going to be a female? Do they use sex chromosomes like mammals do? In fact, there's some evidence that that's the case. So in some plants, and these are some plants that I studied in my PhD, they do have what we call heteromorphic sex chromosomes. So in humans, for example, the X and the Y look very different. If you look at them under a microscope, the X chromosome is very large, the Y chromosome is very, very small. They're called heteromorphic. They look different. This is true in many animal organisms. It's true in some plants. So there are plants where you can look and they're male-female plants and the males have like different looking chromosomes than the females do. Great. That looks familiar to us as people who study and think about animals most of the time. But there are lots of plants where that doesn't happen, where apparently there are no differences in the chromosomes, but there are males and females. And so in this case, it's probably that there's some genetic region, a sex determining region that determines which sex you are, but we don't know anything about that. We've studied this very little. There's also some indication that age may have something to do with it. There are plants that appear to change sex. They'll make only eggs when they're little and only sperm when they're big. Actually, it's the reverse. They tend to make only sperm when they're little and only eggs when they're adults. This likely has to do with resource acquisition. So it's much cheaper to be male energetically. The female has to make the eggs, which are bigger than sperm. And then once it gets fertilized, they also have to grow the next generation. And in humans, that's a child. In plants, we would call it seeds, right? Seeds, the offspring. But you have to put a lot more energy into that. And so it's likely that plants are male when they're young. In these cases, the plants are male when they're young because they don't have a lot of resources and it's the cheap thing to do. But when they get older and they have lots of resources, they can be female because it's more expensive for them. But there's also some cases we think where the environment seems to be playing a role in determining what sex the plant is. There are documented cases of plants changing their sex after stress events. So if you cut off a branch, it may go from male to female. So it's male one year, you cut off a branch, the next year in the spring, it comes back female. Also some association of patch suitability. So again, we talked about resources and it's more expensive to be female. Well, there's some studies that indicate that in more suitable patches, so patches that have more nutrients in the soils, like more nitrogen, more phosphorus, that those plants tend to be female, again, perhaps because they have the resources to do so, and that the plants that end up in not as good patches tend to be male because they just don't have the resources to be female. And again, perhaps age. But these are all just hypotheses in most cases. There are some documented cases, but for most plants, we don't really know what they're doing. And so a project that I'm working on right now is trying to determine for a couple of these different tropical woody Polygonaceae, first, are they using sex determining regions? Is there like an XY system? Is there a ZZ, ZW system? And then if they are they also maybe using some environmental cues to determine what sex they are? All right, and this will be where we'll end my last slide. We've talked a lot about the diversity of these tropical forests, right? We talked about how most of the species are growing in these tropical forests. We've talked about how they're diverse morphologically in terms of how the plants look. They're diverse genetically. They're diverse in the ways that they reproduce and produce the next generation of these tropical trees. Why is it that we should care and be concerned about and preserve these tropical forests or really any forest for the next generation of humans? And there are a couple of different reasons, and these are ones that I always teach my ecology students, and I'll teach you now too. The first is what we call ecosystem services. So these forests and really any other natural ecosystem, a field, for example, provide cycling of nutrients, right? They actually filter rainwater. So if the rainwater lands, it has to first go through the soil. Some of the toxins will get sucked out, and it eventually ends up as clean water in these rivers. These helping of cycling of nutrients, this cleaning of water, we call these ecosystem services, the converting of carbon dioxide back into oxygen for us to breathe. Ecosystem services, things that plants and these landscapes do for us, right? We discussed already economic benefits. So again, most of our medicines, nearly all of our medicines, come initially from plants or animals. If all those plants and animals go extinct, it's going to be difficult to find our medicines. Psychological health. There's a good amount of research that people's psychological health increases. If you're depressed and you take a walk in the woods, you tend to feel better afterwards. If you spend, 5 to 10 minutes out in the nature, the nature every day, your mood tends to improve. Tourism, if you're a country trying to increase your economic standing, you have like a vast natural resources, this can be a source of income for a particular location or particular country. Spiritual value. As Catholics, we don't believe, like some religions believe, that the natural world is itself divine, but we do believe that it is a gift from the divine, and that it is, at least in some ways, at least at the very least in us, but also to a lesser extent in other organisms, an image of that divine, right? And that we can value the natural world in its ability to lead us to God, and we should also respect the natural world in as much as it was given to us by God to take care of. So this is where I will end here. I will give a quick thank you to all of the people who participated in this research and helped me and so on. But I'll now happily take any questions. Thank you very much.
Trying to get my camera. There it is. Thank you, Dr. Koenemann. That was really interesting. And there's so many. I actually had I don't know about anybody else, but I had a lot of thoughts and questions that come up. So while we give the audience time to either put their question in chat, or I think Maritza has her hand raised, so I'm going to let her go first.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Koenemann. It was really inspiring. And the last part that you mentioned about the tropical forest and conservation, the respect for the gift, can we relate this as one of the principles of Catholic social teaching?
That's a good question. I don't know whether it's maybe the respect the gift part is could be considered a core principle. I think that would extend far beyond just the natural world. That would also extend to like your children, for example, right? Or it would extend to your own body, in the sense that you should, like, not let yourself go, and like try to take care of the body that God gave you to the best of your ability, right? But yeah, as maybe as a core principle, you could enunciate that, but it would have like much further reaching consequences than just the natural world.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. While we wait to see if anybody else raises their hand or has a thought, I was really intrigued by the fact that some species can have multiple genomes that regulate. So when a plant is like that, and it has several different sets of genomes affecting its development, is there some overriding thing that organizes how those genomes come together, like a contractor and his subcontractors? Or
some. So at the end of the day, in many ways, the nuclear genome, so the genes that are in the nucleus of the cell, are kind of the ones in charge. But the genes in the mitochondria and the chloroplast themselves appear to oftentimes function almost autonomously, right? They kind of just do their own thing, and they use the genes that they have to do that. Now, that's not entirely the case, because we know that a lot of the genes from the mitochondria and the chloroplast have over time migrated into the nuclear genome. So if you took the mitochondria and the chloroplast out of the cell and said, go live freely like you used to. So this is a theory in biology that the mitochondria and the chloroplast were once free living organisms that got engulfed by our cells and then kind of just now live inside of us. And so if you told the mitochondria and the chloroplast to go like live on your own again, they would be incapable of doing it. They don't have all the genes that they need. Some of their genes are now in the nuclear genome. So in that sense, I would say a nuclear genome is in charge, but they often appear to be behaving more or less autonomously. And this is true for us too, right? Because we have mitochondria that take our sugars and they turn them into energy, and what the proteins and whatever else we eat, right? Our mitochondria appear to function oftentimes effectively autonomously within our own cells. And so we have these like little bacteria that live in our cells and that kind of do their own thing.
All right. So Dr. Golan has asked the question. You mentioned a tree's ability to self-mate. Can you elaborate on how that is done?
Yeah, in many different ways. So that's kind of plant reproduction is when you kind of get out of the animal mindset. Animal reproduction is in some ways kind of boring in that it happens in like a very predetermined way. For plants, it's like the Wild West. They kind of do whatever they choose to do. So you think about a flower. A flower is the reproductive organ of a plant. The stamens produce pollen, and those pollen then produce sperm, right? So pollen is not sperm, but it produces sperm. And then in the center of the flower are where the ovules or the eggs are. So you can either have a flower that has both parts. It has stamens and what we call pistils where the ovules are. And it can just, the pollen can just go from the stamen to the pistil and it self-pollinates that way. You could also have a situation where you have some flowers with only stamens and some flowers with only pistils, that is only ovules. And then the pollen has to go from one flower to a different flower on the same plant and it pollinates itself that way. There are also some plants that undergo what we call parthenogenesis, where they basically spontaneously produce offspring without being pollinated. So there's lots of different options for how a plant could do that. But effectively, the two parts are the pollen and the ovules, and however those can combine. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Joey C., you have your hand up. So you are next.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oops, you muted yourself again.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. You had mentioned in terms of climate and moisture kind of being contributing factors to greater biodiversity closer to the equator and so on and so forth. At face value, is there any kind of plant that seems to, break that mold, like say like sequoias or redwoods? Is there anything that just doesn't seem to fit the mold?
No, not so much sequoias and redwoods. A classic example of that would be mosses. There tend to be more mosses at higher latitudes than at lower latitudes. Though that could just be a study issue, and that mosses, there are some groups of plants that get understudied because people find them boring. Grasses are a classic example of this. It's one of the biggest families in the world in terms of the number of species, but people ignore them because their flowers are very small and they're hard to identify and so on. But yeah, mosses tend to break that pattern. Lichens, which aren't really plants, can break that pattern at times. Outside of plants, there are some microorganisms like small crustaceans that can break that pattern. So there are some examples that break the pattern. Yeah.
Really cool. Does elevation play a factor then too, or is it not as much? Okay.
You imagine elevation is like the same thing as latitude, right? So as you go up in latitude, so away from the equator, it's like going up in elevation. And so you think about the tops of mountains as basically like little bits of like the Arctic, the poles that have been brought down to the top of that mountain. So yeah, it's the same idea.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Dr. Golan posted a second question. She said, on one of your slides, you have the tropics split into two, the East and West, or Old and New Worlds. She's originally from Reunion Island off the coast of Madagascar. And so are there any plant characteristics you can share with us from that specific region of the world? Or if you can't think of them off the top of your head, you can follow up with her later.
Yeah, one of my favorite. So you do have weird plants. The Reunion, I don't think so, but Madagascar, you have the baobab trees. The genus is Adansonia. Let's see if I can put in the chat. Adansonia, which are the kind of classic Madagascar trees. Yeah, baobab. Yep, exactly. I don't know that those are on Reunion, but they are on Madagascar. The other thing, the classic New World, Old World, is how desert plants operate. So in the New World, we have cacti, and the cacti are actually endemic, or they only grow in the New World natively. They've been introduced to places like Australia. I saw Vivian was here. Yeah, so Vivian, there are cacti in Australia, but they were brought there by people. They're not native to Australia. But in Africa, the African deserts have another group, the euphorbs or the spurges, that often look almost exactly like cacti. Basically, they've evolved, as far as we can tell, the same physical characteristics to deal with the dryness and the heat as the cacti did in the New World. They're just a completely different group of plants that are unrelated. So same solutions to the same ecological problems they had to deal with. You also have aloes that we don't really have in the New World.
So an aloe plant's not a New World plant?
Not natively, no.
Not natively? That's interesting.
For sure, they've been brought here and they've been planted here, right? Because we have habitat that is suitable to them. But aloe would be that whole family, the Asphodelaceae, is mostly an old world family.
Okay. That's interesting because those are what I grow best. Aloes.
Oh yeah.
And with my black thumb, I can grow aloe and I can grow cacti.
Yep.
So,
I sympathize because I kill plenty
Okay.
of plants myself.
she put in the chat Dombeya, Dombeya is.
Let's see if I can just look at a picture. Dombeya. Okay. Yeah, so that the Sterculiaceae is the family that same family that chocolate is in. So that is not something, the family is not unique to the Old World. But maybe perhaps that genus is. But that family, actually, interestingly enough, kind of related to the Adansonias. But that genus, that particular group of plants is probably native, but the family that it's in is not. Or the family that's in is, we would say, pan-tropical, right? It's found throughout all of the tropics.
I find it really interesting when you were talking about the hermaphroditic plants. We have hermaphroditic animals as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting though when we think about creation and how it all works together, to realize that everything has its telos, its end, even if that end is only to produce more of itself in some way. So I always find that fascinating when I come across something new.
Yeah, and even in addition to that, we don't always know how the parts interact with each other, right? So a plant that may, or animal that may appear to us as useless, right? May be performing some sort of function in the larger ecosystem that we just simply don't understand.
Vivian asked a question. She said, "Thank you so much for your presentation. It was interesting, and she didn't know there were so many amazing plants living in America. How can someone tell whether a plant or flower is male or female? As a general rule for any plant, or do other flowers differ from plants?"
Yeah.
How you tell male and female?
Yeah. So basically the flower has a couple of parts. It has sepals, which are the kind of the green things on the outside. Next in are the petals, the showy, colorful things. Next in are the stamens, and next in the middle are the pistils. So the stamens are the male parts; they produce pollen. So if a flower has stamens, it has some sort of male capacity, right? The pistils are the female parts that produce the eggs. So if there are pistils, then it has female capacities. If it has only stamens, then it's a male flower. If it has only pistils, it is a female flower. If it has both, then it's a hermaphroditic flower, or we call a perfect flower. And it gets confusing, as Dr. Wina Isabel asked. Sometimes a flower can be female first, and then the stamens will grow out and it will be male second. Or sometimes it will be male first, and then it will grow out and be female second. And so it's kind of both, but at different times. So yeah, but look for stamens. If you see stamens, it's a male flower at least. And if you see pistils, it's a female flower at least. And if they're together, then it's both.
What about non-flowering plants or trees?
Yes. So most trees are still flowering plants, even if they don't
Okay.
always look that way. So the non-flowering plants, conifers, so like pine trees, cypress, and so on, those are not flowering plants. Ferns are non-flowering, and mosses are non-flowering. There are some indications in mosses where the moss can be kind of male-female, though their situation is a little bit more complicated. Ferns, very, very rarely. There are like 2 cases where a fern could be male or female, but ferns are mostly hermaphroditic. And again, some rare cases of actually in gymnosperms, I don't know that there are any dioecious gymnosperms. They might all be hermaphroditic.
There
Okay.
was a
It's
question up
7:30.
above. There
Go
was a,
ahead,
sorry.
Allison.
Oh,
Did I miss
sorry.
one?
Yeah, a couple minutes ago,
Go ahead.
Martine,
Oh
I
yeah,
don't
I
know
see
if
it. I see it.
I don't know if I
Oh,
said your name
okay.
wrong, I'm sorry, but she said, sorry, I don't have the language of those who study. Are there any organisms that act against their way of being? So do you have a male zebra that acts female? I just didn't want the question to get missed.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. That question, I'm not sure if I know the answer to. In plants, there's not a whole lot of behavior. So, though we did in our our meeting the other day talk about plants that can perhaps communicate with each other, but most plants, the behavior is pretty limited. So they don't in that way act against their nature. In terms of animals acting against their nature, there may be examples, but I don't know enough about animals to come up with one right now. So I'm sorry, Martine.
And our last question is, at the gene levels, what differentiates annual versus perennial plants?
At the gene level, what's going to differentiate? Okay, so annual versus perennial. One of them lives, it completes its entire life cycle in a single year and dies. The other one will complete its life cycle maybe in 1 year, or it may take multiple years, but effectively the plant lives for more than 1 year, more than one set of seasons. Certainly genetically, you're going to have a set of genes that tell the plant to flower almost immediately. If you're going to be an annual, that is, you're going to complete your life cycle in 1 year and then die. So you have to flower almost immediately, and you have to fruit almost immediately. And then in plants, like many organisms, it's not super clear why they die. Lots of really old organisms die effectively out of infections. In the same way that like humans die, like there's no genetic code that tells us to die at a certain time. We just kind of break down. It's the same in plants for the most part. So basically the perennial plant's likely not going to immediately flower. It's likely going to grow deeper roots and obtain more nutrients. And basically make itself such that it can survive the next winter. So you only see these annual plants in places where there's like a thermal winter, so it gets cold and things die, they go dormant. The plant is basically going to prepare itself for winter instead of just flowering and fruiting.
Okay. Well, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for attending this evening. Let me share this screen over here. Our next event is going to be on September 16th when Father Bramwell presents on Ex Cordia Ecclesiae. And I got a little ahead of myself. First of all, thank you, Dr. Koenemann, because it was wonderful. And everybody, thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Plants are interesting and cool. So I hope you can join us again on the 16th when Dr. or Father Bramwell talks about Ex Corde Ecclesiae. The Catholic Church has been operating universities for 1,000 years and was involved in education for 1,000 years before that. On August 15, 1990, Pope St. John Paul II issued the Apostolic Constitution Ex Corde Ecclesiae, restating the tradition and experience of the Church as it relates to Catholic universities. As faith nourishes and guides the Catholic universities, Ex Corde Ecclesiae is our guiding light here at Catholic International University. So please join us on the September 18th as September 16th as Father Bramwell explicates the role of faith in the work of the faculty, staff, and students, how research and teaching are illuminated by faith, and how the university is an intellectual community, but it's intellectual in a uniquely Catholic way because it respects the truth. So once again, thank you, Dr. Koenemann for your fantastic presentation, and we'll say good night to everyone, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you again. Have a nice night.
Okay, God bless you. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.